evening. Good evening. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and I am here with Color of Change this evening. And I'm really thrilled for all of you who have the opportunity to join us for a conversation tonight about the Black response. And it's the Black response to all of the aspects of what we are facing in this moment, but with a specific focus on the question of Black business, Black workers, and the question of justice in this COVID-19 moment. As of course we all know, the illness is not one, and the pandemic is not one which turned out to be some kind of great equalizer, as the early conversations suggested. Instead, this pandemic has been one that, like all disasters, tends to reproduce the inequalities in our society, and in fact, tends to provide for us a mirror, an opportunity to see again what we know about the depth of racial inequality in America, socially, economically, and politically. So Color of Change has put together an enormous and extraordinary and wonderful panel for us, not an enormous panel, thank goodness, it's Zoom, but a really great panel of folks for us to talk to tonight. First, we're joined by the president of Color of Change, Rashad Robinson. You all, if you are Color of Changers, and you already know Rashad is an organizer unlike any other. He's a leader. He's someone who has led Color of Change and the team at Color of Change to developing an extraordinary online platform for seeking racial justice. We are also joined this evening by Representative Karen Bass. And I'd like to say, we may see Representative Bass have to step out and come back in. She is governing in this moment. She is working to protect our interests in this moment. She is joining us from Los Angeles. She is, of course, the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. She is, like all members of Congress, also running for office in the midst of all of this madness. So Representative Bass will be joining us, and also sometimes potentially popping out, which might also be true of our mayor who is joining us this evening. Mayor Tubbs is joining us, and in fact popped in, sat down, and said that he had just been talking with the professionals in his community to ensure that there in Stockton, California, not only are they interested in these fundamental questions of economic and racial justice that he has been working on, but ensuring that the health of his community remains sound, that they do not open more swiftly than necessary. We're also joined by one of my favorite human beings on the planet, Mr. James Perry. He is my favorite person, not because I'm married to him, but I married him because he was one of my favorite people. James is the executive director and CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League, and before that spent a decade leading the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center in the post-Katrina moment, and so can bring some analytic lens that question for us. And then there's Mr. Alfonso Cross. Mr. Cross, it's so nice to have you with us this evening, who is a businessman from Atlanta and will really help us to reflect and think about how this moment is impacting Black businesses in a very direct and clear way. So thank you to everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, happy to be here.
I just want to start by setting the stage a tiny bit, and then I'm going to pass it over to all of you as experts. But I think it's worth, since we are going to talk a lot about Black business tonight, just sort of being clear about what we mean when we say Black businesses. So we know Black businesses have grown dramatically since 2010. So over the course of the past decade, far more African Americans in the position of being business owners. At the same time, I think it's important to understand something about the characteristics of those businesses, because it's so important to how legislation affects them. So 95% of African American businesses are sole proprietorships. They're owned by a single individual, or they're LLCs that are held by a partnership. And in 95% of Black businesses, there are no paid employees. And that'll become really important as we talk to Congresswoman Bass and to President Rashad Robinson about how the current process works for supporting small businesses. If you actually don't have a payroll, if you don't have paid employees, it creates fundamental inequity for Black businesses. I think it's also crucially important to understand that Black business owners, like Black workers, tend to be concentrated in service sectors, and often in service sectors that are directly related to person-to-person contact. So Black businesses tend to be either personal services, like, for example, hairdressers, barbers, funeral and mortuary services, and the really crucial one, healthcare services, where we are providing direct care, whether it's elder care, whether it is child care, or whether it is direct services of healthcare. And so I think hopefully, even just in knowing those few little facts, it should start to get clear to you why Black businesses are going to be particularly vulnerable. So Congresswoman Bass, I just want to, with that scene setter, begin with you, in part because you have, relative to all of us, the most direct contact with this question of how we might be able to bring some kind of equity and some kind of justice. So can you talk to us a bit about the position Black businesses and Black business owners and workers have been in relative to the package, which was supposed to be helpful in this moment?
Exactly. And when I talk about business too, I talk about for-profit and not-for-profit, because nonprofits are business. Having run one, and I know Rashad can relate to this, that you got a payroll to meet. It's really no different. And so what I was happy about what we did in the last bill is that we did expand who could make the loans that turn into grants if you don't lay off your staff. And we expanded it to small minority-owned banks and also credit unions, and I think, and then organizations like LISC. I think that's very important. And so the people that I have talked to who couldn't get the door open to Wells Fargo, you'd think Wells Fargo would be rushing to give loans out considering their reputation, and they didn't in the first tranche. But I have found that people were more successful the second time around. Also, our churches are businesses too. And you know that a number of them, the preacher might work Sundays, but has another job during the week. So if you are the only employee, you are eligible. Where it gets dicey is if you're not even the employee, but if you are a consultant. So we're trying to fill those holes. But Melissa, if you don't mind, one of the things that happens in an emergency, and I'm sure it was the same in Katrina, when you have something that happens, lawmakers just take spaghetti and throw it up against the wall because you don't have time to figure out what it should be. You're running, you're sticking your finger in the dam and hoping that works. I happen to believe that this crisis is so profound, both on a health side and also on an economic side, that we are going to be feeling this for the next several years. I mean, Black folks hadn't gotten over '08. We lost our houses, we lost our businesses then. And so the way I view it is that we're getting ready to prepare, we're preparing a bill now that will be voted on in the next couple of weeks. I think there's going to be CARES 3, 4, 5, and 6. And so we need to think short term, but we also need to think long term. And when we get past the crisis and we're in the recovery phase, that's when we try to right some of the inequities.
Congresswoman Bass, I actually think it's really useful for people to understand in part how legislation is made. I think that language of throwing the spaghetti against the wall is a valuable one. I think it's easy to think that there's just sort of a table of good guys and a table of bad guys all figuring out who will be left out and who will be included. But I think it's also important. I want to pop over to you, James, and then I'm coming down to you, Rashad, but I want to pop over to you, James, on that question, in part because it made me immediately think of the Road Home program post-Katrina and the idea that with the destruction of so much housing in New Orleans, that we had to get something done. And so, obviously I know that in your work in Greater New Orleans Fair Housing, you all then went back trying to right the ship and found that folks weren't so interested in writing it. So I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about that perspective. And then maybe, Rashad, I'll pop down to you to think about how we make sure we can still have accountability even in these moments.
It's one of the hardest things to do in the course of responding to a disaster is to make sure that the solutions that you make that you know are going to be lasting solutions are solutions that not only fit the moment, but that will last throughout time. And so, as you mentioned with the Road Home program, it was a program that meant to do well. It was a total of about an $11 billion program. But in the end, it made it almost impossible for Black residents to rebuild their homes. And so I think, as Representative Bass already knows, and I think and it's inherent in the points that she was making, the devil is in the details. And it was so incredibly important that Congress came back to do this second allotment, particularly for PPP. And as much as they expanded it, it's still going to be difficult if you're an African-American owned business. One of the core challenges, of course, is that you have to be able to demonstrate in most circumstances to get the best outcome from the PPP program that you've been doing business over the course of 2019. And you get the best outcome if you have a lot of employees, but if you're like so many African-American owned businesses, a sole proprietorship, or if you don't have a clear payroll process or system, then the payout isn't as great. And it's going to be harder to weather the storm. And so again, it really speaks to, I think, the incredibly important perspective that Representative Bass has, and that the first sets of legislation are really just the start of how we think about dealing with this disaster. We're going to have to come back to the table multiple times in order to make sure that we get it right.
Let me come down to you to think about that iterative process and the role. So I also so appreciate Representative Bass reminds us that nonprofits are businesses too, that you're trying to make payroll. James was raising his hand on that one. I can remember even when we were about to face shelter in place, these were the big questions. How do you shelter in place if we don't know that the employees who are dependent on that hourly wage are going to be able to shelter and still receive income? So I'm interested, Rashad, in your role as a national leader on accountability, how you think about what that iterative process should look like for those who should be holding accountable and making sure that second and third waves are more fair.
Well, it's a couple of things for us. And part of what we've been trying to do sort of via the blackresponse.org, which is the platform, is to provide people a number of avenues to take action with a deep recognition, because of the conversations we've been having with Representative Bass and her office, with many other members of the Congressional Black Caucus and leaders on both the Senate and House side, trying to find really the places where we need to push. And I know, Representative Bass is going to, talk later about sort of where they in Congress need us to sort of press. But for us, we recognize like sending this money through the big banks in the beginning, which is what happened, meant that so many of us, just as Representative Bass said, could not get access to that money. And so sending it through smaller institutions is important, but also providing the resources and the tools for folks to be able to figure out how to actually access those loans. There's another set of things that are sort of converging at the same time. And sort of we have a crisis of unemployment insurance, particularly in the South, where governors like DeSantis and Kemp have not funded unemployment insurance for years. And so part of why this is so critically important is because people are being left out to dry on both ends if we don't get the money from them at the federal level. And these have been sort of tactics of the right, is to sort of give sort of bailouts with no strings attached to the big corporations, and then to not support not support us at the local level. And so part of what we're trying to do is mobilize as much energy around legislation, but also to help the public understand, as money is still available right now, that they have access to it. And for folks who do have access to it, we want people to get access to it. We also want to hear from people about the challenges they're having with the system, so that we can report back to our partners in Congress, helping them understand places that, as the Congresswoman said, over the course of the next iteration of legislation, we're able to identify places where we can recommend additional things that can be done to ensure that we have policies that actually solve the problem. What we recognize here is that we've had a virus of challenges long before Corona, and we will have a virus of challenges long after. Racism is like water pouring over a floor with holes, and it will always find the cracks and always find the leaks. And so if we are not doing the work to consistently change the rules and not just putting money into bad systems, but changing those systems over time, we will not get the results we need.
So Representative Bass, I want to come back to you again, because I'm hoping maybe you can, especially for folks who may be joining into the conversation at this point and trying to think about these questions, maybe some specifics around the legislation, especially changes that have occurred between the first iteration and now. So, I talked with a friend today who, okay, let's just be honest. I talked with my braider today because I just need to make sure she is staying healthy and well until such time as we can see one another and I can address what is happening on the top of my head. And, this is a woman who's been braiding my hair off and on for 20 years. And she was telling me that she's lost her shop, and when they do reopen, it's going to have to be in some other space. And so she's looking, and so just on the most micro personal level, like just seeing that, okay, here's a woman, and she's an African immigrant, but she's been in this country again 35 years. And I keep thinking about these questions of how somebody like her, an institution in a small town like ours, who provides this kind of direct service, and we've been 2 months, quarantined, which we need to be and which she wants to be, but how does she ever come back from it?
Exactly right. And, it is a real dilemma. We've not solved all those problems. We have not at all. I mean, the focus this last time around has been to make sure we could go after those businesses that were not even allowed through the door. I mean, as soon as they knocked on the door, they were told it was closed or they had spent all the money. But the people watching and listening should know that there is still money there and they still should, apply. There is a proposal, though, that makes me think of Mayor Tubbs, who's definitely been out front on guaranteed income. And, Pramila Jayapal and several other members are proposing that because, it's just despicable that the governors in the South, they don't like unemployment. And so maybe we can bypass that system altogether and just give people the same thing they were making before. And so that is a proposal that in ordinary times would seem absolutely outlandish. But it is actually something that we are thinking about, and hopefully individuals like her would be able to take advantage of it then. But the bottom line is that there really are some gaps. I do want to, if you don't mind, talk about an issue that I think is extremely pressing, and that's the fact that Black folks are dying. We're dying. We're not surviving this. And, out of the 70,000 people that are dead so far, a large percentage of those are Black folks. And so what the Congressional Black Caucus is doing is we do have a plan that we want to have put in place. We think if there is a disproportionate death rate, then there needs to be focused, concentrated testing and early treatment in that area. If you put money in treatment generally, then it's not going to go to the area that needs it the most. And we need contact tracers. But we want the contact tracers to come from the community. Don't bring people from outside of the community and have them pick up the phone calling us, asking us our business. You know that they're not going to cooperate with that. And so we're pushing for that. And at the same time, we want our people released, our people who are incarcerated, because those are death camps as far as I'm concerned. And but we want people to come out of the prisons and jails healthy. So we want to make sure they're tested. And so we are also fighting for money for reentry services so that the community-based organizations that couldn't apply for the small business loans, even though they're nonprofits, because people running the organizations have convictions. And so we might not be able to deal with that from the SBA perspective, but we want to put money in these organizations so they can handle our folks when we get out. So those are the things that we are advocating for: expansion of the safety net. All of it is an ecosystem that is together. When you look at our communities, we're not just this, we're not just that, we're all of the above.
Representative Bass, I feel like as I listen to you speak, that what you're laying out is an agenda that has been the social justice equity agenda really since, again, I'm thinking now about Rashad talking about the big banks and needing to put the money through the smaller banks. I'm thinking, oh, well, that's the story of the FHA, right? That's literally a story of 1949 and how Black wealth is stunted, right? At the time that the government, the federal government, creates the American middle class through the FHA, through the GI Bill, it does so in a way that systematically shuts Black folks out of being able to buy those homes and get those educational resources. And so, you know, I'm sitting here thinking, my God, we are 80 years, right, past that, and we're still telling the story of how mass incarceration, how unemployment, how these questions of how Southern governors began to think what it meant to be providing public services via tax dollars after integration. Like it's in some ways an old story. And so Mayor Tubbs, that's why I want to come to you on this, because this idea that actually many of the proposals, the COVID proposals, are part of the social justice equity agenda, right? That has been pre-existing. So talk to us a bit about the work you've done around guaranteed income and how that might help and be helpful in this moment.
Well, absolutely. And I think what's been really in focus for us here in Stockton is this idea that we live in a time of pandemics, and they differ in terms of severity, but if it's not a COVID crisis, it's an earthquake. If it's not an earthquake, it's a flood. If it's not a flood, it's a hurricane. If it's not a hurricane, it's some technological disruption that automates jobs away. That these economic disruptive things we have to stop treating as, oh, this is once in a, no, they happen pretty reoccurringly. And I think a guaranteed income has to be part of that conversation because, again, providing everyone an income floor is consistent with the writings of folks like Thomas Paine and Dr. King, but also really allows people the economic dignity so they aren't forced to go to work if they don't feel like it's safe for them to do so because of pre-existing health conditions. So they're not forced to open up early or forced to work under the table at a time when they're sheltering in place because they have no income coming in, and they're independent contractors who may not know how to access unemployment and insurance. And what we've seen in Stockton from the basic income pilot we started 2 years ago is that in the past month, spending went up from about 30% to 48% on food. Now think about that. These folks were randomly selected from throughout the city, had no idea this was coming. And I shudder to think about sort of how would they be paying for the food without this extra $500? Yeah. And then how are the other 300,000 plus people in my community paying for food? And then again, I think particularly given the fact that this crisis is putting everything in perspective in terms of what's important, what do we value, and what does it mean to really honor dignity, it's an important time to have this conversation. The idea is a simple one. It's that in a country that produces so much wealth, in a country where folks have actually gotten richer during this pandemic in the last 2 months, that we can afford for everyone to have at least an income floor, not to replace work, but to make sure there's a strong foundation in place. For example, as a new father with a 6-month-old child, I see how domestic work is work, being at home and having to do more than my share of dishes, I would add. Dishes and laundry.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I just enjoyed that that's when you found out. You were like, wait a minute, that is not a slogan.
I could do Zoom calls all day, but all this stuff, this is work. And the fact that if you do that for somebody else, you're paid for it, but if you do it for yourself, you're not. And for a lot of people, particularly women who do low wage work, it's cheaper to be at home and do caregiving than to be out working at McDonald's to pay for someone else to watch your kid. And those folks don't get an income. Or to folks like the sister you mentioned. So I agree with you, Rep. Bass. One time it sounded crazy. But I think we live in crazy times and we live in a crazy economy that left 1 in 2 Americans without $500 emergency savings before COVID-19. And I shudder to think about what's going to happen after. And that's why, just to close, I'm so thankful for proposals like the one that I think Senator Harris is putting out shortly around making just the economic relief from this care package last at least as long as this crisis. Not a one-time sort of stimulus, but an ongoing stimulus as there will be ongoing effects, and making sure that the cash actually gets to people in ways that could use it. Like, for example, folks on SNAP can't go online, can't use their SNAP cards to order food online, which puts them more at risk to having to go to stores to purchase food, et cetera.
Yep. Yeah, I'll put one more on the table when you're asking. I don't know if you all are tracking the data, but track the data on diapers too, especially as a new dad. You might really appreciate that. So when families do have to choose between diapers and food, they typically will choose food, and the health effects of not choosing diapers are tremendous. And so my bet is that you'll also see a spending difference around diapers. Representative Bass, I know that you have to pop out because we're at 8 o'clock. So I want to give you one last opportunity to to weigh in here, and then I'm actually going to come to you, Mr. Cross. But I just want to give you one last opportunity to weigh in. We are always asking something of our representatives. I'm interested in what you would ask of us. So for folks who are tuned in, for Color of Changers, what do you need from us to do the work you need to do to bring a more equitable response to COVID?
I need your help. I need your help. There are those of us that are working on the inside, but the inside won't move unless there's outside pressure. If you just think about it, the first bill that we did, well, guess who was taken care of? All the big businesses. Why? Because they have lobbyists that are sitting there trying to write the language of the bill, and in many cases are doing that. We don't have millions of dollars for lobbyists, but we do have millions of people. And Congress, it can take Congress can move in 2 days or 2 years. And I will tell you what makes the difference is the pressure. So for all the Color of Changers, pick up that phone, call McConnell, call Speaker Pelosi. Now she's on our side, yeah. But what helps her move is that outside pressure. And so anything that you could do in that regard, telling your stories on social media, putting them up there, getting mainstream media to pick them up. I mean, one thing that's making me nuts over the media is that they are covering the prison situation, but they're not talking about any solutions. Yeah. They're covering the fact that Black folks are dying, but they want to talk about the fact that we're fat and have high blood pressure and diabetes. We don't have time to worry about that. The house is on fire. We need the fire department. We don't need them to come over and do a structural analysis of the building. We will deal with our underlying health conditions when this is over. Right now, we are dying, and there needs to be targeted intervention. So please help us. Call McConnell, call Pelosi, weigh in on our priorities so that we cannot be ignored. Thank you so much, and I just have the utmost respect for everybody on this call. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate
you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Rashad, I know you have 1.7 million people, so I'm going to come back to you in a minute. But first, I do want to go to Mr. Cross. And are you joining us from Atlanta tonight?
I am. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering. James and I also live in the South, but you live in Georgia, and are living right now and God help you in Atlanta. So I'm very sorry about that, but that's okay. We're
Saints fans.
we're New Orleanians, sorry. But listen, what I really want to talk to you about is that distinction that's happening in many Southern states between hard-hit African-American cities that are being brutalized both economically and in terms of the health crisis here, and then the Southern governors who are making choices that are dealing potentially with their constituents, but not addressing those cities. So we're seeing it everywhere, but the Georgia-Atlanta one is probably the clearest. And I'm just kind of wondering, from where you're standing, how do you address that? How do you, as a business person, think about making that balance between, maybe wanting some freedom to do some kind of business, but also acknowledging and recognizing what is happening relative to the health crisis?
I was just having this conversation with a colleague just yesterday, and the whole thing is, it's an absurd being caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, I'm confronted with the sheer economic reality of the fact that I need to be in business, right? That I need to run a business. I've got staff that, yes, I would like to take care of. Will the world continue to spin on into millennia? Sure, right? But in the meantime, I certainly, I spent 3 years getting my business open. And now here we are, we've only been in business for a year and a half. And we were getting ready to turn a corner and really get ready to do some really big things as a business. Yep. And then to have that rug sort of pulled from under us is very challenging, right? We it's interesting. We have three things, like pillars, that we're focused on right now. And I talk to my staff about, number one, safety of my my staff and my guests. Number two, brand relevance, right? Staying relevant in the marketplace and in front of the marketplace. And number three, revenue generation. But if I do the first two right, the last one will happen. But I have to do the first two, right? I can't neglect the first two. So on the one hand, that yes, I certainly am a business that needs to be in business. But on the other side of that, if anyone were to get sick in my establishment or feel unsafe or whatever the case is, as much as people, and I'm very proud of the fact people really I have a craft cocktail lounge. People love us and sing our praises, and I'm very proud of that. But at the exact same time, the minute someone gets sick, that's over, right? And so as the marketplace will turn on you in a heartbeat. And so there is this reality of having to exist and then having to be safe. And it is, I'm telling you, it is a razor's edge ballerina dance to sort of be able to satisfy both.
And it's interesting when you were saying, we were just about to turn a corner. And so, James, I want to come to you on this, because I feel like that's where, I know that's where a lot of individuals, families, businesses were feeling that, nobody wants to talk about the economy having been actually kind of pretty robust over the past 4 years, because it still was horribly inequitable. But there were, we were in a tight labor market. My teenager was able to find a job, really basic, like teenager minimum wage job, right? That's just a thing in a tight labor market you're able to get, which, may not be true come October, right? And James, I'm thinking about some of the folks I saw you working with from the Urban League, where they had just begun businesses. People were feeling like brave enough to take that sort of that step out as, I'm thinking, who I'm thinking about in particular, the, young African-American woman who is a single mom, who is a tech person and had just gone through her first year of business, but, she's in a kiosk in a mall. And so, I can't even fathom the circumstances she's in now.
Yeah, so listening to Alfonso talk about the challenges that he's facing, they just ring so true. And you and I obviously had a chance to cheat a little bit this afternoon, looking at some of the data, and you and I were both shocked. I think initially shocked, but in the end not surprised when we saw that that the highest percentage of Black-owned businesses is in DC, but that's closely followed by Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida, all states that are in the South, and all states where governors either were slow to shut down because of COVID or were in a rush to reopen. And so then as we talked about it, obviously we got to this point of thinking through that for a lot of those businesses, they are exactly what we see, which is African Americans who have had difficulty in the workplace, in the traditional work environment. And so they came up with a hustle. Right. Yep. And sometimes that hustle was able to give them more income than their traditional work source. And so what do they do in this circumstance where they don't qualify for the PPP loan? They don't qualify for these small business loans. They're between a rock and a real hard place. And so when I hear Cross say that he's, was at that turning point, there's so many African-American businesses who I see at that turning point. And I'll just pivot here for a moment to Mayor Tubbs' point about universal basic income. In our household, we're just a house full of nerds. And so I've been tracking universal basic income for a long time, and particularly tracking your work on it. I've admired it. And part of what was so compelling about it is this idea that because the United States is doing so well, that is part of the reason why you have to make sure that something like this is available, that you have to make sure that there is a process to make sure that folks don't fall through the gaps. It isn't this presumption that the United States does so well that we don't have to have any backstop. Instead, you make sure there's a backstop because we're doing well. We can afford to make sure that's happening. And so if you extend that basic concept that we're setting up for, that you have already set up for individuals, and make sure that that's a concept that also works for small businesses and the most challenged businesses, which tend to be African-American and Latino and other minority-owned businesses, it only makes sense. And so my greatest hope is that in a crisis like this, it is the moment where we're able to see across the board that we have to have this type of reform to make sure that there's opportunity for everyone in the workplace and in the business environment.
But if I could just touch on that, it's really interesting because very oftentimes in a lot of these conversations, right, we have a tendency to talk very heavily about housing, right? Housing inequality. We definitely talk about income inequality without a shadow of a doubt. There's a couple of things here. No matter what, no nation, until they fix their poverty issue, really sees the type of growth and type of stability that they need to really see, right? Until you fix poverty, it's always a house of cards. I don't care what nation, and I mean, any sort of historical context. I think what's actually really interesting about all this is that we're now talking about sort of Black sort of business income inequality, right? Black business inequality. And this is something I've been talking about for years, and it's very interesting. So here in Atlanta, right, we have all of this massive development going on. And in all of this mixed use development, which we're talking tens of hundreds of thousands of square feet of commercial space, the Perry family apparently are data nerds. Well, I'm a very big sort of nerd around small business owners and the access points for Black small business owners. And so in all of this mixed use development, there are very, very few minority business owners that are part of these developments. So the way that the city has actually set this up is that anything north of a particular part of Atlanta, as if you're a Black business owner, you can't get a lease, you can't have access to the type of density and around development that's happening right now. So all the stuff that's happening on the east side and all that kind of stuff, if you're white businesses, you get to take advantage of all of that density. It's a lot less dense on the west side of Atlanta, right? But we're sort of, as business owners, being marginalized or sort of ghettoized to be in these parts of towns that aren't dense enough to really get to take advantage of all the wealth development that's happening, especially here in Atlanta over the last few years. And so my issue with these conversations is that they don't go sort of far enough to really get into the real weeds on. My theory is that, as far as I'm concerned, in the city of Atlanta, there should be an actual fund set up, a small business. The city of Atlanta needs to get into the small business, and that they actually need to set up an actual fund with no less than $5 million in it and identify 5 to 7 small communities in Atlanta, and then identify industries that we know are going to make those neighborhoods work, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about all of this sort of inequality happening at a granular level, but it needs to happen at a granular level, not just in people's homes, but around the wealth building that's available through owning a business. We all know that owning a business is actually one of the ways that you're able to drive wealth and multi-generational wealth building. And so when you really put together a fund like this, you're actually able to say, hey, so-and-so, your so-and-so neighborhood, you want a grocery store, which is what everyone always talks about. I ran a grocery store for 3 years to the tune of $300,000 that I had to put into my own money in an underdeveloped community, only to go out of business 3 years later. You know why? There's not enough people in the neighborhood. And so now we're asking small business owners to do the work of the city and put in hundreds of thousands of dollars only to go out of business later. And so these funds need to be set up in such a way that the city is in the business of small business. They do the rent abatements, or they actually purchase the property. They do the first round of inventory. They do the build out. They put the POS system in place. And then you're literally dropping the keys into a hand of a qualified operator that maybe puts 10% in or 5% in. But now a business owner can start running a business without the crushing weight of debt associated with starting a business. So for a lot of Black business owners, we're already on the back foot, right? We're already behind because we're either one of two things. We go into business and we're very undercapitalized, so we don't have operating capital, which means that we now are just sort of struggling to get sort of every week, right? Or every month, or we make the investment, but we have to make the investment in our communities because we can't be in communities where we'd actually make real money. And now we're buried under the weight of crushing debt. Either one of those scenarios is not great for sustainability. And that's my sort of driving conversation here in Atlanta, is that we really need to take a moment and understand how best to support these communities by way of supporting the businesses.
So I want to say that part of what I heard here reflects part of what I heard from Congresswoman Bass, who said that in order to get to a more just set of outcomes, we can't, for example, test widely. We have to test in the communities where the greatest inequality is, right? Where is the death? That's where we need to go and do the testing, right? So you don't get to a racially just outcome with a racially neutral policy, which actually ends up being a racist policy. So Rashad, on that,
yeah,
you want to
I really want to build off of what Brother Alfonso was saying, because I think it's really important, because what he was saying here and what he's illustrating is how inequality isn't unfortunate like a car accident. It doesn't just happen, right? It is manufactured. It is unjust. And because it's manufactured, and far too often, right, we talk about systems in passive voice, right? We will say Black people are less likely to get loans from banks, instead of banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We will say Black people are less likely to get hired for jobs in tech, instead of tech employers exclude Black people from loans. We create this idea that constantly asks questions, what's wrong with Black people, instead of what's wrong with the system. And so part of that then leads to a whole set of public policy that is deeply flawed. And so why we felt the need at Color of Change to build the Black Response, which is the platform where we're running these campaigns, which gives us a whole set of corporate level campaigns, campaigns that are actually at policy, is because what we need to be doing in all of these conversations is centering racial justice. And sometimes when people talk about racial justice, they think of it as charity, right? Sometimes when I'm on the Hill, I hear members of Congress say, yes, we want to help vulnerable communities. And I'm like, vulnerable is a personal trait. People are not vulnerable. People are exploited. They are attacked. They have had their communities fleeced. And so we talk about it's just sort of happened with this social service language that gets us charitable solutions to structural problems. And so what we're really trying to focus on is what are the force multipliers for change? And we believe fundamentally that if we don't have racial justice at the center of the story, we don't actually undo all the norms that got us in here, right? We talk about Katrina, which James has talked about, and James did so much work in helping to fight for the type of equitable recovery that should be animating all the fights that we have to have. But part of what happens in moments like Katrina and Flint and COVID is that if no one is nervous about disappointing our community, it doesn't matter what kind of research report that illustrates all the disparities, because people will simply just talk about charity. We actually have to have the ability to be able to have policies that deal with the problem. And so, part of the work that we're doing is supporting Representative Jayapal's bill, which Congresswoman Bass talked about, which is a piece of legislation that, if passed, will help deal with the fact of unemployment insurance, but will also help bypass these big banks, which have been a bottleneck for getting us the type of resources. We're supporting, universal basic income and recurring payments to folks, not just one-time payments, ensuring that we give things like Essential Workers Bill of Rights, which is going to be essential to ensuring that people who, in many cities, I live here in New York, and every night at 7:00, there's something really beautiful that happens. People get out on their streets, and they get out on their balconies, and they bang drums, and they cheer for folks that in many places, we weren't fighting to get those folks $15 an hour. We celebrate folks who we didn't fight for to have health care. And so, we talk about this as Color of Change, is the difference between presence and power, the difference between shout outs from the stage and actually changing the rules. And so folks don't need us cheering for them, folks need us fighting for them. And that has to actually be the work that we do in this moment, because the catch-22 that people have been put in is not some sort of unfortunate situation. It is part of the strategy of the right. And the only way that we win, and Congresswoman Bass said it, right? She is a member of Congress, and the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus. And what she did to folks who are watching is she asked for your help. Right? She is a member of a body with 435 people that gets to set the rules of the rules and the laws, gets to appropriate money. And she said, I need you. I need you to stand up and push, because that is the only way that we're going to have enough power to make change. And so we're asking you to join us in this effort, because that is actually how we get to the point where we can actually build the type of consequences where, whether they are Democrats or whether they are Republicans, they begin to be nervous about disappointing us, because you better believe that the corporate corporations who are trying to fleece us are not just showing up to Republican offices with their briefcases, they are showing up to Democrat offices as well. And if we are not creating the scenario that there'll be consequences, then, we don't stand to win.
You are always one of my favorite storytellers in terms of the ways that you help to frame the language around racial injustice. So this idea that it's not unfortunate, right? It's quite purposeful. And in fact, when you talk about that data around inequality, I think about these incredible social science experiments where people were asked about whether or not they supported the death penalty, and then half were told about the racial inequalities around the death penalty. And people actually became more supportive of the death penalty after they found out about the racial inequalities. So just saying that there is racial inequality certainly will not get us there. And so, Mayor Tubbs, I actually want to come back to you around this, in part because the kind of leadership, I think it is crucial that the leader of the Congressional Black Caucus was like, please protest, not out in the streets, but please create the pressure that allows us to do some of these things. So I'm interested because in your role as mayor, there's sort of two things I'm interested in here. One, you did something which even you a moment ago said this was unthinkable, right? This idea of a guaranteed income. And so I'm interested in how you felt like you had room, how your constituents or how your supporters helped to make room for you to have a more courageous position on that. And then secondly, I want to ask also this question about being a mayor in a context of mayors and governors and then federal leadership, when the leadership on top may not end up behaving. Okay, you got it. I'm done with the question. Go.
Yeah, and I think, Rashad, we could use some help on the governance level in terms of framing just the blood on Donald Trump's hands for just the lack of preparedness and the lack of strategy, even now, for dealing with COVID-19. I'm shaking my head because we've been having a long conversation in our county. So just to give you context, Stockton's the most diverse city in the country. It's about 11% African-American, but we sit in San Joaquin County. So my city council is 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. My board of supervisors are 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 1 person of color on that board. So it's interesting. It's an interesting political landscape. And we've been having this conversation about opening up. And the issue is that there's not enough testing, enough contact tracing. In functional democracies, your head of state would have made sure that there's a strategy for mass testing of folks and a strategy for contact tracing so we can open up in a way that's safe to do so. So to answer your question, Doctor, it's really caused me to spend a lot of time communicating, but communicating in a way that holds folks accountable, but doesn't seem like I'm pointing the finger or kicking the can down the road. So part of my job is being the explainer in chief.
Yeah.
I have to every week talk about, hey, I don't have a public health officer that's a county person. I don't control her. She doesn't report to me. It's the conversation I had with her. I need you to call her and email her if this is important to you. I've had to educate the public about the role of kind of the state mandates being the floor, and that I can't do less than what the governor or the county dictates. I can only do more. I've had to educate the public about why it's important for me to wait for the county and wait for the public health officer, because I'm not a doctor. And I need what I say to be backed by someone who's actually trained in the field and can speak as a medical professional about the risk and et cetera. So it's been a trial by fire for sure. In terms of making space, I would, on the basic income pilot, Doctor, that was actually a kind of tough political lesson for me, because I didn't wait. I was like, poverty is the biggest issue we have in this community. There's a group of funders who want to pilot this idea. Let's do it. And I have spent the last 3 years bringing the community on with me. And I think in retrospect, I would have a couple more friends if I had waited and built up political will. But I also think part of
aren't you like 23 or something? Like that's kind of like
I'm 29 now. But I'll also push and say, and I do agree in the need for pressure. I tell my community pressure. But at some points, as leaders, I think Dr. King said, you have to be a molder of consensus. Sometimes you have to be catalytic. Sometimes you have to push. Sometimes you have to be out there and then inspire your folks to join with you. Because oftentimes your folks may have the same values, but don't have the same level of information or interest or haven't been exposed to the idea. So I try my best to, when we do both things, like the both violence reduction work we've been engaged in, I do my best to try to educate while moving and saying, like, this is you guys have elected me because these things were important. So it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, but trust me and hold me accountable. It doesn't work all the time. I have a lot of people mad at me, but at least it allows us to try some things, to do some things, and to do our part to make the lives of our folks better.
So I do want to come back because we've talked a lot about businesses from the position of business ownership and business leadership, probably in part because of sort of who we are sitting here on the panel. James, I thought I'd come to you around some of the worker justice questions, and I'll also come around to you as well, Rashad. But I just so distinctly remember as we were waiting here in North Carolina for the shelter-in-place order, and we knew it was coming, right? We knew we were like 48 hours out. You know, the schools had gotten close. We saw it happening. And, you know, you and I are married. And so there were these moments I was like, well, so you're done going to work, right? You're not going back to the office, right? You're not going back, right? You're home now, right? And the conversation you were having with me consistently was a worker justice question about your hourly employees, and particularly your elderly hourly employees, and what you were waiting on, because we had a non-functional democracy, about what was going to happen for their incomes. And so I'm just wondering, both from the position of being a nonprofit leader, but also in the work you've been doing since since the pandemic has really impacted all of our communities around these questions of worker justice.
Yeah, and before I get there, I just want to give a hearty here to Rashad. You know, you have no greater cheerleader than I guess probably the two in our household. And your work is just absolutely amazing. And you know that I began following the work of Color of Change right after Hurricane Katrina, because it was one of the few organizations that said that the African American community has to be supported, and has to be supported from a strong policy standpoint. And so for all the folks who are watching on Facebook, so I'm following on Facebook Live, it makes such an incredibly strong difference when people step up and they actually put their voice on those petitions, and they actually call and they actually do it using the Color of Change process. And I've seen that work nationally, and I've seen it work using Color of Change petitions here in North Carolina and Winston-Salem. And so I just want to, I think people get it, but it's really important for folks sometimes to hear it, not from the person who leads the organization, but from people who've seen the impact over and over and over and over again. So all that said, the core challenge for us at the Urban League, and I think for so many other organizations, was, what happens when you have hourly workers, and particularly when you have folks who you know are going to be affected by COVID-19. For us, we had 105 employees who were 60 or older, mostly African American, and I knew that if I shut the doors, on one hand, they weren't going to have any income at all. But on the other hand, we needed to shut the doors to keep them safe, frankly. And so it worked out for us. We were able to raise enough money to provide them supplemental employment income so that they could be at home and not have to transfer back and forth to work, and that they could stick with the orders that were in place. But obviously, what we know is that the majority of that so many African Americans, so many folks in the Latino community work in the service industry, and play key roles as essential workers. And for many of them, they had a fundamental and very difficult choice: do I work and put food on the table for my family, or do I not work and because I want to keep my family safe from the COVID-19 crisis? In this community, only a few miles away from our home, there's a Tyson chicken plant. And the largest breakout of the COVID-19 crisis in this community is at that chicken plant, where workers have been working constantly to make sure that there's food on the plate of people, not just in this community, but certainly throughout North Carolina and probably throughout the entire region. But going to work and working in really difficult conditions has done little more than to ensure that they were sick for unfortunately a pretty small paycheck. And so this issue of making sure that workers are adequately protected is one of the most difficult and challenging issues. And I think particularly in southern states where workers' rights aren't ever protected. It's so rare that you have progressive laws in place, and so it's part of why I started with those accolades for Rashad, because that point rings so true that it's not enough to simply to say that this is an important issue, but you have to actually push and force folks who are in legislative positions and in positions of power to actually make the change. And there are only a few ways to do that. And Color of Change is one of the few organizations that will stand with you as you make that change happen in your community.
That means a lot. Thank you. That means a lot. And, and we are, and the team, needs partners like you all on this panel. So I appreciate that. And like you said, we need, no campaign moves without the people.
So because I know that Color of Change is really about, this is like, that's always so we are nerds in this house, but the nerd divide is I'm just a nerd and I just get to be one. And then James is a nerd, but actually has to do things because nonprofits. So what I want to do is make sure that we don't just nerd out on analysis, but actually get to a few action steps. So I'm going to walk through just each of our four panelists who are remaining to ask for one action step from where you stand. And Mayor Tubbs, I might ask you specifically to, if you want to address the AmeriCorps piece, you don't have to, you could go beyond that, but I really thought your AmeriCorps piece was very important. But if you could just say sort of one thing in this moment that is for you a call to action for the Color of Changers and for other folks who are joining us, a call to action from where you stand. And so Mr. Cross, I'm going to begin with you.
I want to just say something real fast, and then yes, that at the end of the day, as a small business owner, mayors, governors, presidents, at the end of the day, to a certain degree, for a small business owner, it doesn't matter. The marketplace will dictate what we need to do, and we will act accordingly. We will act accordingly to make sure that people are safe and that people are good. And so if people aren't going to come out, it doesn't matter if the governor or the mayor or anybody says everything's open, we need to make sure people are safe. That's what, as small business owners, we're charged with that. So we'll take that mantle. I think as far as any sort of policy or whatnot with regards to Color of Change, I really do think that it really is about working with our city officials, specifically our mayors, because leadership is top down, working with our mayors to really make sure that they understand the reality of what it means to be a small business owner in 2020 and beyond. And so it's something I even proposed to our mayor, is that really they should be sitting down with our business owners once a month and really actively listening to what works and what doesn't work. Some of this stuff is very simple. It doesn't require massive amounts of policy. It just requires thinking about taking a moment and taking a step back to understand where the needs are.
Thank you. Mary Tubbs, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, well, first, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for your skilled facilitation and teaching at the same time. I don't know how you do that every time, but you find a way.
They used to pay me to do this.
Yeah, I guess that's what the professor does. That makes it. But in terms of action items, I think there's two that this community could be very, very helpful with. Number one, again, you've heard from myself and others on this call that there's bills in Congress right now from the Senate side and also on the House side to make sure that these economic relief checks are done in a way that's ongoing and not one time. I think that's just incredibly important to really build economic resilience, to really allow folks to shelter in place, to fortify, to provide for themselves and their neighbors, and to do everything necessary so that when small businesses are open, they have the cash to frequent them, so that they're able to pay their rent and their mortgages when the rents and mortgages are due. Because although there's been a freeze on eviction, there hasn't been a freeze on rent. There hasn't been a freeze on mortgage, and that number's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger the longer we go. And then the second thing, as you mentioned, Doctor, was that we just wrote an op-ed in Washington Post about calling on Congress to scale up AmeriCorps. So AmeriCorps could essentially function as our work progress administration sort of job guarantee for the 21st century post-COVID. And through AmeriCorps, we could make sure folks whose jobs have left and aren't coming back, or folks who are deemed non-essential workers, are able to work, but still have student debt to pay and bills to pay, to allow them to become the contact tracers and to provide all the service that's still going to be needed during this time. So there's a couple bills in the House that talk about scaling up AmeriCorps in our communities, but essentially it's basically an understanding that, and I think that's the beauty in this crisis, is that it's focusing on what's really, really important and what's essential. And what seems to be essential are women of color who do the majority of the essential jobs. What's essential is a service economy, people who are serving, whether it's serving in nursing homes, serving as first responders, serving as childcare providers, et cetera. And I think we, in this moment, since we know that that's essential and that's important, we have to demand a society that treats them as such as part of our path forward.
Thank you, Mayor. James, I'm going to come to you on this.
So two things, and I'll just start by saying that COVID-19 is so wide and so broad that it affects basically every aspect of our lives and of who we are. And so when you think about what you do, what is the action step? For me, it's pretty simple. It is this idea that you need to actually do something, that you need to actually take action, right? And so, not to be a company guy, but I want to basically make my plug for using Color of Change as the entity by which you take your action. I think one of the most powerful things that you can do is to start a petition today for the issue that's most important to you on Color of Change. And then you become the catalyst to make change in your own community. And so you can both, of course, sign up for the national actions that are happening, but then the idea that you are making the change in your own community right now by signing up and starting up your own petition, I think is infinitely powerful and will go incredibly far in your own community.
Man, James, when you said you were going to be a company guy, I thought you were about to say something the Urban League could do, but I love that you went with Color of Change. Oh, I'm so for that.
No, that's a different Zoom conversation.
I'm so for it. Rashad, I will end with you. I know that you all have a Protect Black Business campaign that is occurring right now. Based in part on what I heard, I think we also need a side hustle safety net in order to ensure that that folks who are hustling to make it all work. But I'd love to hear, and I'll give you the final word on this.
Yeah, I mean, part of what we are advocating for is something that is much more expansive than what is currently on the table, which does deal with side hustles, which does deal with folks in the gig economy, which does deal with all the ways in which income is being blocked because of the rules. And, at theblackresponse.org, you can take a wide range of actions. There are also a lot of actions on there, as James said, that have been started by everyday people. A lot of the work happening right now locally around criminal justice and decarceration is being led by local organizations. Many of the campaigns around protecting against rent-free, around evictions, and advocating for rent freezes and policies that will, ensure that landowners and landlords will get the resources they need and that folks will not be evicted. Those campaigns are being housed there and people are, taking those actions. We are working to ensure that communities have healthy food and some of the other resources, broadband access in our communities, particularly for our young people who are having to deal with schools, all the ways in which if we're privileged enough to be able to move our work online, that many online spaces are not friendly for our work. And we have to fight on these online platforms, even while we sometimes have to use them. So we are on a platform right now that we are oftentimes fighting. In fact, we're on multiple platforms right now that we are oftentimes advocating for. And that's what it means to be Black in America. We are on Facebook, that we are fighting around algorithms. We are on Zoom, where we are fighting. And then we are on land that we are oftentimes fighting. And that it means that we have to have all sorts of strategies to do that. And in the process right now of actually working with Zoom to get some real changes to how they do business, and then also working with their competitors to set new standards across the industry. All of that is important. And then we are also just every single day just Black in America, and seeing all sorts of ways in which the world impacts us. And for folks who have seen the viral video of Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot, gunned down, and then all the ways in which the system did exactly what the system is designed to do. We are fighting for justice for Ahmad, you can text the word justice to 55156. That's the word justice to 55156. Justice to 55156. We will put it in all of the chats, but it's the number once again is 55156. And that's a way for you to sign the petition, take action. We are demanding a resignation from that district attorney who threw the case. We are also will be building power around around other sets of demands that deal with justice in that community and looking at other ways in which we mobilize to ensure justice. But as an organization that is constantly as a racial justice organization that's constantly looking at all of these issues, finding the pathways for participation. And then the final thing I just want to do is invite you to the next conversation we're having, which is actually tomorrow at 4:30, right back here on Facebook. We will be, and I'll be in conversation with Majority Whip Clyburn. And we will be talking with him and getting questions with the most powerful Black person in the United States Congress, and actually digging in to what's happening. Once again, where we're pressing, hearing from him in terms of the Majority Whip is in charge of counting the votes and seeing where we're at and having a very real conversation about all the ways in which we're fighting and hearing from him about the priorities that he is moving inside of Congress. And so part of what we're trying to do at the Black Response is both give you as much information and awareness, but also helping you take action that is strategic and that is powerful. The final thing I just want to say is I want to thank my sister, Melissa Harris Perry. You are always excellent. You're always brilliant. And you always come with so much information and background. You constantly educate us. You constantly make us better and smarter. And I so appreciate you and all the things that you continue to do with us and the ways that you make us better and smarter. So thank you for joining us and moderate us and taking all of us through this conversation. Representative Bass had to leave early, but we thank her as well. I'm kicking back over to you, MHP.
Great, thank you. And Rashad, you guys are one of the few folks, if you call, I say yes always, because I love the work that you all do. I want to first say thank you to all of my panelists. I just want to say, Zoom actually is exhausting, and not just the Zoom platform, but all of this is exhausting, and it's late in the day, and I know all of you are doing real work, and so I genuinely appreciate you taking the time, because part of what Color of Change has also been doing in the context of this crisis is convening us. And yes, we do need to convene for parties online, and yes, Mr. Cross, I think brand relevance, if you would like to send craft cocktails to the next Color of Change, to all of us, I'm down for that. Total brand relevance at this moment. But let me just say, yes, we have to, we're going to have to convene for all those purposes, but we also have to convene in ways that are safe and reasonable, but also deeply effective. And I appreciate what Color of Change is doing on that. And let me just, finally say, we're here and we were talking about one aspect of this, in part because you cannot talk about all of it all at once. But just know that there is no person sitting here who doesn't have a clear understanding about the level of personal, communal, national pain that we are in. We are looking for solutions to all kinds of crises, but this is also an excruciating moment. The losses and the inability to even say goodbye, the ways that we have seen how little Black lives seem to matter to so many. And so part of what we do is we come together to do the work that we can, because as my father always said, the struggle continues. And so our job is simply to stay in the struggle, and we'll stay in that struggle with Color of Change. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.